Hello everyone. Oh, that was quite loud. Sorry, just kind of jolting you all into, you know, that evening slump, jolting you all out so you can get ready for this incredible panel that we have today. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this panel on fascism and resistance after Charlottesville, organised by Novara Media. And thank you so much to TWT for allowing us to put on this star-studded panel on a topic that certainly keeps me awake at night. So the way the format is going to work is we're going to dive pretty much straight into a conversation amongst our panelists, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. I would ask that, you know, there's a lot of people here and, you know, we're quite time limited, and I want to make sure that everyone who wants to speak gets a chance to speak. So I'd ask for questions to be kept quite brief, and also to be questions, preferably. Great, so without further ado, I'm going to get on with introducing our speakers, and then, actually no, I'll introduce the topic of the panel a little bit. No, I'm going to introduce the speakers, I don't want to waste time listening to me. So to our right, we have Kojo Karam, who is an activist and lecturer at Essex Law School. We have... we have Ash Sarkar, who is a writer, activist and senior editor at Novara Media. To my left we have Eleanor Penny, who is a senior editor at Novara Media. We have Bhaskar Sankara, who is the founder and editor of left-wing New York-based magazine Jacobin. And finally, we have Ben Waters, who is an organising member of the Anti-Fascist Network. So, a round of applause for everyone. So, it's 2017. Once again, we're finding ourselves contending with the very real threat that fascism poses. We've just had Breitbart in the White House, some terrifyingly near misses in European government elections, and, as is referenced in this panel title, an undeniably fascistic Unite the Right march in Charlottesville. So, first question to our panelists, how the hell did we get here again? Kojo, do you want to start us off?
Thank you. How did we end up here again? Something that we've probably all been asking ourselves recently. And I think we can start off by thinking about what the significance of that again is. So the idea that this is a recurrence or repeat of a previous historical moment, most likely everybody thinking about the mid-20th century, the rise of European fascism across Italy, Germany, and Spain, and thinking about what are the similarities and what are the differences in the era that we now find ourselves in. And I mean, some of the immediate differences that I think is by looking at that historical moment and starting to recognize how indebted mid-20th century European fascism was to the long legacies of kind of European imperialism. So I think there's often been different understandings of mid-20th century European fascism. You've got the Trotsky understanding of it being the way to smash organized labor. Once it starts to get too much power, the capital can't really manage it anymore. But then you've also got the understanding from people like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, who talked about how mid-20th century European fascism was the return of the violence of the colonies into Europe itself, the kind of logics and theories of European imperialism, absolute difference between people, the endless competition amongst resources between those absolute differences of people being brought into the European body politic itself, often like straight from Europe. If you're thinking about Mussolini's troops, straight from the colonies, you think about Mussolini's troops from Ethiopia or Franco's troops from Morocco, and that being the kind of core of mid-20th century European fascism. I think the failure to try and understand that and the way in which like Fanon, Césaire, and even European thinkers like Arendt, who saw European fascism as indebted to colonial violence, the way that explanation's been kind of shoved to the side and minimized has meant that we never really unpacked and confronted how European fascism emerged in the mid-20th century. And I think that that's allowed a lot of the same rhetorics, a lot of the same ideas to resurface now in this new historical moment. And you can see that with the way that, you just look in the comment section of Breitbart, or, it just reads exactly the same as Stormfront, a lot of the same ideas, a lot of the same violences. So I think one of the main things we want to do is to try and understand why fascism emerged in the mid-20th century, and to see what are some of the continuances in this current moment.
Always so awful having to follow Kojo. I feel a bit like Kelly Rowland trying to go solo after Beyonce, so please buy Dilemma out now. So because I don't have time to go all the way back to 1492, I think I'm going to start this kind of historical unpicking with 2001 in terms of how the fuck did we get here. Because I think all too often when we have these discussions about the rise of the far right, it's framed in a way that makes us, the people in this room, feel really comfortable. We're not the people out there with Confederate flags. We're not the people saying white power. We're not the people, tattooing England flags over every exposed inch of skin. So we can't be responsible for any of this. And I think part of the reason why it's so easy to disavow the violence of the far right is because of a conflation between white supremacy and fascism. I think these two things are very closely related, but you cannot simply collapse one into the other. Because sure, fascism often is an insurgent political force with regards to the state apparatus. It's about, kind of colonizing it and bending it to your will. White supremacy isn't an insurgent force in the state apparatus. It in fact shaped those very state apparatus from their inception. And so thinking about 2001, the reason why I'm starting it there is because we often remember New Labour as, yes, an unholy alliance between public and private finance, an unaccountable executive, but we tend to think of them as this kind of diverse, ragtag bunch of modernizers. What we forget is the tenure of David Blunkett as Home Secretary. Because while in 2000, certainly you did have the introduction of the Race Relations Act, which provided some limited protections for minorities in the workplace, in that very act you had immigration officers being made exempt. So it was essentially open season called on non-EU migrants, on Roma, on Sri Lankans, on Somalis, etc. Similarly, while you did have the phrase institutional racism being used in the Macpherson report in 1999, which was a huge moment in terms of UK race relations, as it's known euphemistically, by 2001, David Blunkett had rejected it out of hand, saying that the mere slogan of institutional racism had missed the point, right? It neglected to engage with the power of individuals to reproduce racism. And I was like, oh, way to miss the point, David, all right. And at the same time, what you have is, the capitalist classes making the case for racism in state policy, because you had the number of successfully granted asylum applications being halved. But that didn't mean you had less migration over that period of time, because in the period of 2 years in which they halved, the number of temporary working visas doubled. So there's an unholy alliance there between the forces of capital and the forces of racism. Through mobilizing racist state apparatus like Borders, you're able to create a hyper-exploitable class of labour, namely people of colour. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because there is an uneasy but indeed fatally effective symbiosis between the racism of the street and the racism of the state, because while New Labour were pursuing the asylum issue with a ruthless, dogged determinism, the BNP were making gains in the white flight ring around London. Now obviously the BNP collapsed. What's interesting is that between the BNP's relative electoral successes, where they were polling like 17% in Barking and Dagenham, that was then replaced immediately with UKIP. UKIP has since collapsed as a party force, but that racism hasn't gone away. So to kind of round up these opening remarks, I want to ask you guys a question. It's a very simple question. Who do we punch in the head? Who do we punch in the head? How do you punch visa healthcare surcharges in the head? How do you punch data collection on citizenship in our schools in the head? It's easy to punch a fascist in the head and, it's really fun. But that's only half the fight that we're facing, and I think it would be remiss of me to say that when, that our failure to engage with the scale of it has not led to, in some way, the situation that we're in now.
Thanks for that, Ash. Following on from your critique of the institutional, the long-standing origins of the situation in which we find ourselves, I want to preface my particular angle and this discussion entirely with a note of caution around how this event has been framed, and that is as something extraordinary. Particularly because of the spectacle that that white supremacy and that fascism has manifested itself in recent months, in recent years, it would be easy to think that this is an exception to the rule, when really fascistic style policies have been a long-standing weapon in the arsenal of capital when it wants to manage populations in times of crisis. And I think this is an important point in pushing back against the liberal analysis that really left-wing ideas and alt-right and Nazi ideas are really along the same spectrum of deviation from a political norm, when really what fascism does, one of its key tools, is the weaponization of one of the categories on which liberal democracy founds itself, and that is the category of citizenship, which is where Koja was very prescient to point out the colonial origins of fascism, because the origins of citizenship very much found themselves as the antithesis of the colonial subject. And now citizenship is not a category of universalism, it is a category of geographic exclusion. By defining populations who are othered, against whom legitimate violence can be done, what you have is a training ground for the most totalitarian, the least humane, the most excesses of state power. And those excesses are routinely in fascism visited back on the population as a whole. Now, people of colour and other populations always suffer worse, but this is the dynamic in which we're experiencing at the moment. When Theresa May talks about the need to survey and police migrant populations, what that is a license to expand police powers and to expand surveillance powers, which are then popularized, if you like. And so I don't think we can properly understand the pushback against what a lot of people would like to call the normative centre, without realising that this is a kind of an exaggeration of norms that are very much at the heart of the liberal establishment. And we can see that by how easily street fascist movements have been metabolised by establishment forces. There was a fascist demo in Chelmsford yesterday, which was called off because only 6 people turned up. That does not mean that we have been successful. Sorry to break that news. It means that they've rendered themselves obsolete by the sheer efficacy with which that they've succeeded in dragging mainstream discourse to the right and legitimating the instincts of a coalition of racists, capitalists, misogynists, to do kind of what they were wanting to do anyway. And I think this idea of legitimation is important to push back against something that really, really, really aggravates me, and that is a really, really simple link between economic immiseration and the rise of the far right, and the rise of Trump, May, Bloc Identitaire, whoever you want. Because yes, these things have materialist origins, and yes, fascism is very usefully understood in many ways as a response to crisis of capitalism and as a way of unifying the interests of the white working class and the white ruling class when those divisions get sort of heightened by economic immiseration. But when we look back at the kind of populations who voted for Trump, who are signing up to far-right movements across Europe and the US, and increasingly across, say, India, those aren't the most routinely degraded populations. Those aren't the populations with the most wealth. They are white people. And this is important to remember because without the role of white supremacy, the economic analysis of capitalist crisis as giving rise to fascism makes no sense. Because what fascism trades on is a rupturing of a deal struck at the heart of white supremacy. And that is the promise to made between like white working populations or like white dispossessed people and white elites, say that like, we will give you slightly more dignity, like more wealth, more security in response for you doing the work for us of managing like these excess populations, as they were seen. That's why you get the Ku Klux Klan and like other racist organizations as sort of doing the work of enforcing capitalism, because you're doing the work of like disciplining the bodies of people of color who are like on whose bodies are loaded like the worst, the most degrading work. And because we see the immiseration of white people as somehow unnatural, as somehow the economic and political system gone awry, that is what gives rise to this sort of sense of outrage. Not the sheer fact of immiseration, but the fact that this immiseration is an infringement of this deal. And this deal is at the heart of contemporary political institutions and a contemporary white sense of self. And yeah, so you can't overlay fascism with white supremacy because the one is insurgent and the other is long-standing, but I think the two feed into each other in like a productive loop and kind of don't make sense without the other, structurally speaking. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you, first of all, I'm loud enough to begin with. Thank you very much, Navarre, for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. I like the banners. I'm kind of confused about that one with the horse, though. It's Communication Workers Union. I'm not sure why there's a horse there and no workers. There does not appear to be any communication this evening. Yes. I mean, I guess, obviously, you know, this is not a cherry subject for a panel, but I think the good news is that we're, I believe, not living in an era of the mass resurgence of fascism. And I think the key difference is this is in an era with a strong workers' movement. The capitalist class is not particularly in crisis. Capitalist democracies are in general politically stable. And you know, I think generally we are seeing the emergence of a populist right that does feed into elements of the far right, which are obviously benefiting from this, the existence and the strength of the populist right, let's say represented by a figure like Donald Trump. And I think the distinction is important because we can imagine politically defeating this populist right, but also this far right developing in the context of populist right defeat, right? So if you think the far right is scary in the US now, I think they'll actually be quite a bit more scary perhaps if Donald Trump is routed in the 2020 elections and if there continues to be this kind of breakdown and fracturing of his kind of motley coalition of right-wing forces. I think there is this threat down the road. I think in general how we counter this threat is through a combination of a sword and shield, approach. I mean, and part of this means not just talking about the right, but examining the kind of whole field of struggle in front of us. So we use the shield, obviously, to defend. Sorry, I'm taking this metaphor too far. I shouldn't have. But bear with me. We use the shield against the threat of the far right, but also we use the sword against the neoliberal center, partially because creating a political alternative to the far right means distinguishing ourselves from this neoliberal center. It means selling people hopes and dreams and not just fears. And at a broader level, I mean, this is all just tactical questions, right? I think a lot of the efforts done, let's say in the U.S., against the fascist, fascist right, have been, in the short term at least, so far successful. We've done it through mass mobilization. There's been a lot of debate in the liberal media about, let's say, whether or not we should punch fascists in the face, about free speech, about all these other things, but it doesn't actually seem to be really affecting the fact that we're still able to mobilize tons of people around. If we were at a point where, let's say this big demonstration we had in Boston, if we weren't able to mobilize that many people because of the existence of big certain types of anti-fraud tactics or whatnot, then I'd be willing to have a conversation. But as is, it seems like a distraction, because it seems like the diversity of tactics is not actually preventing us from building this kind of broad-based coalition, which is, I think, isolating and marginalizing the far right. But fundamentally, I mean, I do believe in pushing forward a broad-based universalist politics that can capture the hopes, dreams, and imaginations of every worker in the United States, in the United Kingdom, of course. And I would say beyond that, I mean, I think the only point that I think I would differ than some of the other opening statements is that I do think there is. We obviously are against things like borders, right? We stand for a world without borders. We should be socialists, we should be internationalists, we should have that perspective. But the nation state is also one of the few avenues that we can still push through democratic demands. So I think we should, I hate the word, we should think about it dialectically, where even if the nation state is exclusionary, even if we hope to one day abolish it, it's still where we could push forward democratic popular demands, and through those demands, we can actually push forward a viable internationalist politics. So I don't think we should be so defeatist as to say that we can't have a viable left-wing politics unless we do away with all these other kind of features of the state. I think there's a huge difference between saying that in the short term we could pursue a project of left social democratic politics and saying that we are capitulating to nationalism. Because, of course, if you start backsliding on, let's say, an issue like immigration or whatnot, not only are you fueling the far right and the populist right, no one really trusts us, right? If someone really cares about immigration, for example, as their main voting issue, who would they rather vote for? A bunch of people with broadly left rhetoric and in other respects that just all of a sudden decide to be more realistic on immigration, or are they going to vote for the people who have been most consistently, being racist and against immigration or whatnot? So, but I think our fundamental goal shouldn't necessarily be an ideological struggle to try to take these bad ideas out of someone's head, but rather to make this hopefully their number 3, number 4, number 5 issue, not their number 1, number 2 issue. And then if we so absolutely convince them that, in fact, a left-wing broad program would be in their interest on issues of jobs, on other key issues, then I think we're in a good situation where that slides to 3 and 4, and they're willing to vote for the dirty reds despite our stance on supporting immigration and other kind of internationalist politics. And I think that's really what we should be aiming for, a broad-based politics that speaks to people's hopes and dreams. And as we fight, and I think that's the best antidote in the long run to fighting the far right. The last thing I'll say is that, in general, I found it useful to think about, it's a concept, I think Howard Brick, this US academic, used very similar language, to give him credit. But we must have kind of one foot in the world as we want to see it, and 1 foot in the world as it is. If we have 2 feet just in kind of the bubble of the radical left, then we'll just be a very large subculture, or in the case of the US, a pretty small subculture. If we have 2 feet in the world as it is, and we subsume all our politics to kind of pragmatic day-to-day policy making and whatnot, then we'll just end up replicating the worst of social democracy and the worst of the right-wing slide of so many of these historic parties of the workers' movement. So I think we need to have 1 foot in the world as we want to see it, 1 foot in the world as it is.
Hi. Yeah, so I kind of want to focus mostly on the British context, and I'm going to try and fit about the last 7 years into 2 minutes. So if I miss anything, apologies. So starting off with the EDL in 2010, touching on what Ash was saying, they built upon that kind of war on terror rhetoric of being against Islam, against Muslims, against jihadism. These weren't your granddad's fascists, these weren't the sort of like old school anti-Semitic swastika waving fascists, these were Israel flag waving fascists. And they built up a kind of popular Islamophobic street movement. And their basic strategy was to find a town, go into it, do a big demonstration, kick off, attack kebab shops, attack Muslims, and then that would then build onto the next demo and the next demo and the next demo. I'm from a little town called Aylesbury, which is just northwest of London, about 30 miles northwest of London. And I remember growing up as a kid there, my local pub was sort of an EDL stronghold. There was always, every single weekend, watching the football, there was 20, 30 big blokes in EDL t-shirts, and when they came to the town, there was probably about 2,000 of them maybe, I think, and it was huge, and it put the town on lockdown. And yeah, so they had these demos week in, week out, building and building and building, but kind of through, I suppose, consistent anti-fascist mobilisation. The anti-fascist movement was kind of caught on the back foot. There wasn't really this sort of long-term structure there to oppose it, so it kind of had to be built ad hoc. But eventually, sort of like 2014, 2015, I think the EDL sort of start to fall apart, and they can no longer maintain themselves either through infighting or police repression. And the EDL splinters into much, much smaller groups, and they called themselves like the infidel groups. And these were much more kind of like, yeah, it's funny, like more white supremacist or moving much, much further rightwards. Whereas the EDL in its early days, you would have seen black faces on their demos, definitely not in these sorts of small groups. And then these groups, the refugee crisis or the borders crisis starts to happen, and that starts to mobilise the far right again, and then these sort of old splinters from the EDL start to coalesce with older forms, older parts of the right, more neo-Nazi, neo-fascist parts of the right, like the National Front, new emerging groups like National Action, and they coalesce into sort of, a potential emergent organisation, and all of this culminates, I'm sure all of you are aware of what happened at Dover. There were 3 sort of big demonstrations at Dover around the refugee crisis. That was a kind of key focal point for the fascist right, because that was, where all of these terrible refugees were coming in and invading our lands. And it all kicked off in January 2016. There was a massive confrontation between anti-fascists and this kind of like emergent coalition of the far right. You had out-and-out neo-Nazis on this demo. You had kind of people from the patriotic right, like the EDL. All of the different sorts of groups were represented, and then that coalition fell apart, and most of them are either in prison now or inactive. And now there's sort of been a lull in kind of big mobilisations, big far-right street activity. I think it's definitely true that I think a lot of the fash feel as though their desires and needs have been won through Brexit, and they were really, really happy that Brexit happened. And so they perhaps don't necessarily feel the need to go out and mobilise en masse. But recently, with sort of recent terror attacks that have happened in London, and Manchester, we've seen kind of the emergence of what might become a new far-right fascist street movement. It's not definitely there yet. So in Manchester we had the return of Tommy Robinson. He was the former leader of the English Defence League, and he left and he's gone and done his own project. And we had sort of like 3,000 people out on the streets in Manchester. Took the anti-fascist movement totally by surprise. We were, you know, people were kind of expecting it to be in the hundreds. It was thousands of people, and it looked just like an EDL demo. And then you've had another organisation. Again, it doesn't look like a fascist organisation. You see people of colour on the march. You see people of colour on the panel. Like there's a Sikh bloke speaking, but it's definitely Islamophobic. It's definitely you know, it's got undertones of racism there. You see the leader of this group, the Football Lads Alliance, doing interviews with kind of, you know, right-wing nationalist media outlets. So they marched back in June. And then you have the sort of media outlets. Obviously, we've got our own media outlets, the fascists have theirs. So you've got Breitbart, but I think most importantly in the British context is things like the rebel media. A really, really slick looking, it doesn't look far right, it looks so well made. And you know, trying to popularise fascist ideas. And Tommy Robinson, obviously involved with the rebel media. And one of the key things that they've been doing, away from the kind of metropolitan centres, is going up to Sunderland, which is a sort of city in the northeast. The anti-fascist movement there is very, very weak or non-existent. The kind of organised extra-parliamentary left there is non-existent. And they've managed to jump on this case of a young woman allegedly being sexually assaulted by 4 refugee men. And they've managed to build up this huge popular street movement encompassing wide layers of the community who would never ever buy into kind of like a swastika flag waving kind of fascism, but they would be happy to buy into kind of this sort of coded racism. So yeah, that's kind of where the far right stands at the moment. It's been the more reactionary elements of it have been smashed and they're sort of in prison or inactive, and then you have these potentially huge networks of right nationalists and Islamophobes, you know, around football lad culture that, if we're not careful, can be tapped into by already existing fascist street movements, and we could have another EDL on our hands. Again, I have this issue with this like after Charlottesville sort of thing. You know, the EDL were around before Charlottesville, Dover, all of this sort of stuff. The fascists, they don't look the same, but they never went away. And that's why we kind of need long-term anti-fascist organisations that don't just pop up when a fascist movement pops up, but are there, you know, putting in the hours, doing the hard work, chasing them around the country. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those really incredible opening statements. And one thing that I sort of noticed was that is kind of a thread through all of them, is this idea that, you know, the kind of coalition of white supremacy, fascism, capitalism, and how, you know, the proximity of the fascist ideology with liberal ideas of citizenship and all of this. And what interests me is how in the kind of mainstream press and in the kind of mainstream framing, this has been flipped on its head. So we have a situation where the far right is able to portray, you know, the radical left and the neoliberals and the kind of cosmopolitan elite or whatever as being in the same boat, and they are the anti-establishment, they are the anti-political correctness, whatever. This brings me back to something that I was reading a while ago about how when the far right were after the sort of 60s, when the kind of new right was emerging, they looked at the new left and they looked at what was happening in the 60s and the 60s and said, we need to replicate that project of hegemonic sort of struggle, but for our own ends. They read Gramsci, they engaged, and that it was this kind of, again, this like long-term sort of way of like this long-term vision that is now to an extent coming to fruition. So how did this kind of hegemonic idea of the far left, the neoliberals, etc., all being in bed together and them being the anti-establishment, how have we gotten to the point where that is the framing that's being pushed forward, and what can we do to fight back against that?
Do you want to go first?
Okay. Brilliant. I mean, well, firstly, after hearing all the other speakers, I definitely don't think I'm worthy of Ash's Beyonce description. Maybe Michelle or even LaToya after, compared to everyone. But onto the question of how is it that now we get these kind of neo-fascistic ideas presenting themselves as being countercultural, and we can very much see that in terms of the way a figure such as Milo tries to present himself as being this kind of provocateur, being this kind of, you know, gadfly, kind of inheriting the kind of countercultural legacies of the New Left in the 1960s, the event at Berkeley that they're currently organizing at the moment. I think and this is one of the differences. So in the first part, I spoke a little bit about the echoes and similarities between mid-20th century fascism and this current moment. But I think one of the interesting differences is the way in which now these figures present themselves as actually being the defenders of kind of liberal humanitarian universalism, like the ideas of liberal democracy, ideas of free speech, which in the 1930s and the 1920s were seen as decadent, were seen as a weakness of the European state. And now you see the adoption of these figures and the idea that they are defending them against erosion from Islam or feminism or whoever is the boogeyman of that day. And I guess one of the things that I think we'd have to consider if we wanted to counter that is to recognize how it wasn't that this kind of political correctness, this idea around, you know, multiculturalism was ever truly the hegemonic ideas, even though it was presented as that, as I think Ash and Eleanor spoke about in their earlier panel, in that kind of, you know, post-1989, end of history, triumph of globalization and liberal democracy. Inherent within that was always kind of state racism. Inherent within that was always kind of these structures of neo-imperialism, or you know, that kind of remained an anchor within those systems. So now when you get the far right presenting themselves as a counter to the failings of that post-1989 moment, I think what they're actually doing is recovering those lost traditions that always remained at the core of kind of Western political rhetoric and discourse. And so I think that's one of the main things we want to do to try and counter that, is to recognize that this isn't a countercultural moment. This is actually using something that's always been used by the hegemonic power, something that's always been used by Western states, to, you know, regardless of the kind of rhetoric of humanitarian interventionism and stuff like that. This kind of racism has always been there, and to try and, force a figure like Milo to recognize how much he has, you know, in common with what has been the consistent trajectory of, Western power since the 20th century.
I mean, I think whenever we address these questions of politics at the mainstream and politics at the margins, I think it's useful to return to a critic called Russell Ferguson, who wrote a great book in the 1990s. And what he wrote was this: when we say marginal, we must always ask, marginal to what? But this question is very difficult to answer. The place from which power is exercised is often a hidden place. When we try and pin it down, the centre always seems to be somewhere else. Yet we know that this phantom centre, elusive as it is, exerts a real undeniable power over the whole social framework of our culture and over the ways that we think about it. And so I think thinking about this phantom centre is a really useful way to think about the ways in which racialisation and racialised dominance shapes our politics. If the centre is always somewhere else, you don't consider yourself to be there, which is how you can have these completely contradictory positions of a deep-held belief in white supremacy, and, you know, a natural mastery over the world, and also white abjection and victimhood, right? That there is no one more screwed over than white people by the forces of multiculturalism or cosmopolitan capital, that you can hold these ideas to be true at once. And I think one of the things that we need to do is contextualize what can be these really abstract, quite airy-fairy, arty-farty theoretical discussions into some concrete material shifts. And I think we need to think about crises of whiteness in terms of the crisis presented by decolonization, right? A crisis that this country has never been able to acknowledge or look at. Most of the time they'd like to deny they had a colony in the first place. It's like, oh, what's this? Spices? They just fell in like that, what? And the other is a crisis of deindustrialization. And the reason why I'm twinning these two things together is because both these economic, historical, social shifts showed that the center of British identity and geopolitical dominance and economic dominance was not in Britain. These things were constituted internationally, they were always elsewhere, and this dominance was then always inclined to go elsewhere. And I think that's how you can have that intense, sense that Britain as a national culture is riddled with anxiety. So I think this sense of abjection held by the far right is not exactly off the money in terms of responding to historical shifts. It just doesn't, that's not the same as saying that you've been screwed over by multiculturalism.
I think it's interesting that you pick up on the sort of tactical lessons learned by the far right of the 60s and 70s from the far left of the 60s and 70s, because we're seeing exactly that kind of dynamic playing out at the moment. Not so much in the US and not so much in the UK, because we don't really have that much of a left culture, but definitely across Europe, across like Northern Europe especially, where they have a sort of long-standing institutional slash kind of romanticized cultural forms of like left culture, even despite the fact that those have been sort of very, very much detached from any kind of like materially existing sort of left settlement. And you can look at that. There's this group called Génération Identitaire, just to ham up my French pronunciation there, which is a kind of coalition, a pan-European coalition of nativist movements. They are young, they are media savvy, and what they've done is that they have read up on their 2001, 2000 anti-globalization movements, and they've read up on their Greenpeace. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to mimic the spectacle for the exact same reasons that, say, people on the radical left, further to the left of, say, the Corbyn Project, are trying to ape the spectacle of kind of no borders politics, who are trying to, because they're trying to create a space in which the like traditional structures of power can expand. In which, say, Trump projects can flourish, and that sort of that kind of tension of posing as countercultural when really what you're trying to do is using it as a means to seize the reins of traditional cultural power, is a way of. In which the racism of the state is very much feeds off, is very almost parasitic of the racism of street movements, because what street movements do is that they morally license the worst vicissitudes of state and international racism by just looking like the bad guys, right? Génération Identitaire recently made headlines by hiring a boat to go and stop migrants from crossing from Libya. There was one boat, so like good luck to you. But and people came out in their droves to condemn this, including the EU politicians who were at the time funding an identical initiative that was just going to be way more effective than any like bunch of idiots with like guns and one vote we're going to be. And that transformed itself into what's just happened, which is a deal between Italy and Libya to return all migrants coming across what is now the busiest sea crossing for migrants into Europe, and return them to what is now pretty much a failed state. That is a mandate for murder, and without the ability to distance themselves from the clear fascism and white supremacy of people who will go and like hang the banners saying traitors from the Brandenburg Gate, accusing the EU of not quite being racist enough. Without that, I don't know, they might be held up to some scrutiny, and like, what would they do then?
So I think, in fact, neo-fascists are a countercultural force, in that, you know, there's been actual real victories in the last few decades, right? The tale of the left isn't just a tale of defeat. There was feminist advance of civil rights movement in the US, of course. There was the advance of national liberation movements. There have been successful decolonial struggles. Sometimes, because we're in such a bad situation today, we like to go back and rewrite a history of left history that's all a history of defeat. And I think in many ways, I think we've had just as many triumphs since the emergence of modern left politics. I would say that, you know, there's a certain way in which we should acknowledge we're living, obviously, while talking about the racism that still persists, we are living in a less racist society, and they don't like this. There is a way in which they're rebelling against it. So I think we need to call and portray their counterculture as what it is, as terribly boring and backward looking and whatever else, while, you know, saying it is something, you know, bizarre and unique. But at the same time, we also need to differentiate our vision of a just society from the, in other words, differentiate socialist internationalism with liberal cosmopolitanism, because I think there is a difference. So in other words, I think a socialist internationalist position would be for pro-immigration and pro-humane response to the refugee crisis, but also anti-EU. And I think that's a kind of balance that will differentiate ourselves from being, you know, lumped in. Of course, the far right is always going to lump us in with, you know, it's all far right. You know, there's you know, the far socialist left are just in the paymaster of, you know, Jewish bankers or whatever else. You know, this is the nature of far-right, you know, ideology is to lump these things in. But the real question is about the broad base of other people and who can be won over from a populist right rhetoric. And, you know, I would say that, you know, if we're in a situation where for years there could be a social compact that said, you know, the pie is getting bigger. And you're going to benefit from a growing pie, and that compact existed until, you know, the mid 1970s, let's say. Since then, the pie is staying the same, if not shrinking a little bit in real terms, and shrinking. But how were a lot of center-left forces able to portray themselves as being progressive and actually make some real advances? We have been able to argue over the size of the pie, but we have won real gains in the spheres of representation and cutting up the pie to make sure that things are at least mildly more equitable than they used to be. Now, there's a base of people who are looking at this and they're correlating two different things. They're saying, look, I see other people getting more and I'm not getting anything, no one's speaking to my needs. And I think that that's a layer of voters and supporters of not the hardcore ideologues of the far right, but the populist right that can and should be won over. And I think we really will cut a lot of their social base from under them, and without capitulating, without ceding any ground on issues of anti-racism, on issues of internationalism, actually presenting a positive, affirmative program. And I do believe that there's enough commonality and enough common interests to do that. I mean, in an objective sense, there is a way in which capitalist society does unite us from, you know, the common experience that a lot of people have, which is being subjected to the domination and exploitation of others as a means to survive. You know, that basis of being a worker still means something in an objective sense. Our task is trying to create a subjective politics to that objective reality, which is of course very difficult, especially in a condition of complete fragmentation. But what you're all doing here, broadly, the shift that's happening in the Labour Party is all part of creating that positive alternative politics. And of course, that's not a counterpose to more militant anti-fascist tactics and whatnot, but the tactics won't be effective without this broader framework.
Yes, I suppose like fascists have always been nicking the rhetoric and symbolism of the left, and it's always important to remember that in ways they came out of the left. And yeah, they've been building up a racist common sense over the last few decades. And for me, the biggest expression of that racist common sense is Islamophobia, anti-Islam sentiment. But that Islamophobia hasn't just been pushed by the far right and the fascists, it's also been pushed just as much, if not more, because they've got more media outlets and stuff like that, by liberals, the centre, even the Labour Party. Remember 6 or 7 years ago or so, Gordon Brown coming out saying British jobs for British workers. That could have been straight out of a BNP pamphlet, and he was saying that sort of stuff. So people on the radical left, people like us, need to kind of distinguish ourselves from those parts of the liberal left. We need to criticise fascism, white supremacy, and the racist arguments they make, but also not from the position of a neoliberal. We need to not do it draped in an EU flag. So yeah, as I say, the struggle needs to be against both white supremacy and fascism in its street form and in its explicit form in outlets like Breitbart and The Rebel, but also racist neoliberalism.
Yeah, I think, coming back to what Bhaskar mentioned about, that ever-elusive dream of socialist internationalism, that we've been pining for many decades now. I think, this is, Labour Party conference is happening right down there. This is the world transformed. I think it's really important for us to have a chat about what we can do, given the current position of the Labour Party. We've just had a situation where free movement has been denied a debate in the main conference. It's not going to be put on the priority list. For many people, the manifesto was great in many ways, but one way where it wasn't so good was on this issue of free movement, and this kind of general, as I would see it, failure of the UK left to really tackle the issue of race and power beyond just this kind of wishy-washy multiculturalism. So I think as people who are, organising within the Labour Party or organising in groups that are meant to be putting pressure on the Labour Party, in terms of tactics, in terms of, how can we ensure that the Corbyn project does not prolong the conditions that have given rise to the situation that we find ourselves in?
I mean, my suggestion for that is don't collapse all politics into the Labour Party, is build neighbourhood, community, anti-racist projects. So thinking about what that looked like in the 70s and 80s, and I by no means advocate a politics of nostalgia. There's loads of really good shit about living now, like falafel and Twitter and stuff. I'm not saying that, we've got to be slaving over a photocopier just to be doing anti-racism right. But every single borough in London had police monitoring shops. And so that not only meant that you had a project of challenging the police and holding them to account over racist policing that was outside of this, the state, so you weren't just relying on something like the IPCC, but these were neighbourhood community spaces. They were places you could visit. It was a hub of activity. Similarly, in Newham in the 70s and 80s, because there were so many fascist and far-right and racist attacks on black and Asian school children going to school, women like my mum and my grandmother, hold tight, organised escorts to and from school. They were literally putting their bodies on the line between the forces that wanted to harm their kids and children. And it wasn't just a reactive politics saying, well, here's something we don't like, how do we stop it? It was about developing a social network, for want of a better phrase, right? Something in which people are interacting warmly, affectionately, generously. I think one of the things that we have done on the left is think that matters of liberation are consigned to intra-leftist conversations, whether in rooms like this or on campuses or in online echo chambers, and those things are all important. But fundamentally, we don't live our lives in rooms like this, or at least I really hope we don't. And so I think what we need to do is start looking at those organisational forms, and they're not just ones in the UK, but thinking about how the Black Panthers offered school breakfast programmes, right, and even healthcare in certain places in the West Coast of America, in terms of meeting needs in the community, right? Meeting the damage done by racialised economic violence and creating neighbourhood spaces which have at their hearts anti-racist liberation, but it's not about, you know, creating a superficial culture of political correctness in which white people are like, oh, what the fuck is this?
I mean, I think I absolutely agree, and to follow on from that, as because often when you point out the importance of these counter-hegemonic community building exercises, that can be framed as an abandoning of any kind of hint of a Gramscian project that is geared towards seizing traditional means of say, sharing, well, not production, they don't go that far, like distributing the gains of capitalism, etc., etc., etc. But I think when we're diagnosing this moment, it is important not to forget where Corbyn came from, and what made the Corbyn project possible, and that was not through trying to triangulate with the sort of most reactionary forces in the Labour Party. That was pretty much by abandoning the Labour Party and focusing attention on street movements, on centres of cultural and academic production, and on community building, which coalesced the common sense of things like anti-austerity and the importance of childcare and the importance of social care, all of which can be seen in the current Labour manifesto. Where you see radical stuff in the manifesto, lines can be drawn between that and exactly the kind of organising you're talking about. And in order to make possible an unpicking of the legal apparatus of anti-borders, the legal apparatus of border enforcement, that's not going to be about saying, okay, so how do we talk about legitimate concerns in the sort of this spectre of like the racist Labour voter in some northern town, which is just the most patrician, patronising image you can summon up, but whatever. You do it by just kind of ignoring them, just kind of like calling them out consistently on their bullshit, because there's like the idea that that is a diversion of energy away from a Gramscian hegemonic project is to fundamentally misunderstand what Gramsci was talking about, and we would be absolute idiots to make that kind of failing when the alt-right are not. They've read Gramsci way better than most of the people on the left have. Sorry, guys.
Just to, I guess, build on what both Ash and Ellen have said, I think a really important element of this this role of community building, this role of creating these spaces in which people experience a different way of engaging in social or economic relations, is the fact that it manages to respond to the failure of, I would say, not just this kind of liberal capitalist moment, but the longer history of capitalist social production in being able to capture people's desires and experiences of how life should be lived. And I think that this is something that we should be careful not to ignore. And I think it's something that we forget now, especially in comparison to the international socialism of the mid-20th century. I think international socialism in the mid-20th century had a better understanding that some of the provocations behind this kind of fascism is not simply rational economic concerns that are responding to the kind of given precariety of people's lives. This is part of it, absolutely, but it's not the entirety of it. I'm thinking of the relationship between Trotsky and Andre Breton is writing the Surrealist Manifesto. I'm thinking of Sartre and his engagement with how some of these desires for fascism are rooted in things like the unconscious, things like envy, things like desire itself. And I think that what's so useful about spaces like the Black Panthers Free Breakfast Program and some of the community spaces that we might be able to create today is that they do a better job of trying to capture some of those desires of people, some of those needs for connection, some of those needs for the realization of desires than the capitalist system. And I think giving people an experience of that is a really effective tool to try and puncture the attraction of fascism. I think that, yeah, it's something that I would say that the alt-right has understood a little bit better than we have at the moment, that this isn't simply a case of, like I say, humans being logical, rational, calculating figures who are responding to those kind of given conditions. They realize that there are, to use the lexicon of the moment, certain triggers, certain voids that can be filled by these kind of deep stories about who people are and how they should live their lives.
So, as it relates to kind of keeping, let's say, Corbyn and the movement around him, and honest, I think a lot of it boils down to avoiding the trap of electoralism. So obviously, elections are very important, but elections are only important if you're actually building the social base to actually go about and achieve transformations. So, I mean, that sounds kind of vacuous. It was vacuous, but I just used that 5 seconds of Stalin to add some substance to that. So basically, right now, one important thing to remember about even the last election result, at least based on your exit polling, it seems that right now, Corbyn's vote was one of the more cross-class Labour votes in history. So the irony is, it's a Labour left's policies and ideas, but a lot of it's the coalition that New Labour always wanted and thought it would get. Lots of middle-class professionals mixed in with other people, and so which I think is fine as an electoral phenomenon, but it does mean that the actual social base and social weight the party has is quite a bit lower than it was at other historical moments when it might have had worse politics programmatically, but actually had the deeper ability to actually implement reforms. So I think part of the construction from below of some of the things that was discussed earlier has to be tied in with actually giving substance to the labor movement. Now we often think of the Labour Party. So now we often think of these as completely separate, siloed things. You have the electoral manifestations of the left, we have social movements, then we have the trade union movement. When the left was at its strongest, these have all been part and parcel of the same. And the whole, I think, goal should be to make the Labour Party a manifestation of a broader workers' movement. Bring in struggles against oppression into that workers' movement and make sure that it shapes its complexion and its politics. But I think kind of bringing these things together. The only last thing I would add on is I do have some caution around the emphasis on politicized social service work, partially because just given the historical examples, this tends to lead, I would imagine even more so in this context where we are politically, into the dangers and pitfalls of a kind of left NGO-ism, where you're engaging with people as kind of service recipients, like they're your clients and people giving a service. And I think we should question to what extent that was the element that was actually deeply politicizing. So the Panthers were, of course, for example, crushed brutally by the US state, who sowed divisions and did whatever else, that's without a doubt. But fractions of the Panthers did survive, and quite successfully, but a lot of them moved right into one, electoral politics of running in Democratic primaries in Oakland and doing that kind of work, and then that eventually kind of turned rightward. Not really in necessarily all a terrible way, like, like a handful of them ended up kind of with more broadly liberal politics, in the American context, liberal politics, not the worst thing in the world. And then the other really deepest example of actually utilizing this kind of broad-based creation of an alternative culture and social services and whatnot was actually the early German Social Democratic Party. And we know where that ended with war credit, 6 million dead, and now they can't even get 20% in an election. So all that's to say is that I think it is important as a component, but we should be wary of just the traps it would go into. I think especially now in the NGOism, I think is a really big danger on the left at the grassroots level, just like electoralism is a danger at the kind of higher levels of policy making and whatnot.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. This is just something that I really did want to get addressed, particularly to get you guys thinking for when you come into the conversation. So we've chatted a lot about racism, about race politics, and what role that is having in the kind of politics that is gaining traction now. But very heavily embedded in this racialization is gender. So I'd really like to know what the panel thinks the role of gender and gendering is in this contemporary iteration of fascism, right-wing populism, etc.
So I'll just grab the mic quickly as the man to talk about gender. But only because I think this is a topic that, I have found particularly fascinating over this particular manifestation of right-wing populism, fascism, whatever we might want to call it. Because I think it actually speaks to almost a kind of new changes or new manifestations in how misogyny actually functions. Kind of a new stage in the historical materialism of misogyny, you might call it. Because I think, and this is against the kind of, most crude and vulgar understandings of how identity are constructed, which think about gender and race as like different boxes you can tick on, those really boring forms that we all have to fill out. And instead, we understand them as really quite distinct historical phenomena, which lead to them having different, I would say, kind of different eschatological conclusions in relation to what the people who are pushing forward these oppressions imagine. And so I'm thinking of the way that race has often been imagined as what an American academic, Lewis Gordon, would call a theodicy, in terms of it imagines a pure holistic being, citizenship, the nation body, which there is an infestation, a problem. In the American context, the black people was often called the Negro question, the Negro problem, and someone like Teddy Roosevelt famously said, the ideal is the erasure of the question of the Negro through the erasure of the Negro itself. And this is obviously very clear when we think about European fascism and how that dealt with those racial, infestations. Thinking about particular peoples as a problem obviously leads on to something like a final solution. And so the kind of eschatological dream of racism has always been the erasure of the racial subhuman, completely gone. And that's often very different to the way that gender oppressions have kind of operated, which has often dreamt of the complete control and domination of the figure of, of the woman, the complete control of the woman and her reproductive potential. And this is true of fascism, and I think that's still there to a certain extent. And Ben mentioned how in somewhere like Sunderland, a lot of this modern kind of fascism is indebted to the idea of protecting the woman who's part of our community, who's going to be used to populate the nation in the same way it was in the 1920s and 1930s. And that's there, but if anyone else has wasted as much of the previous year looking at you know, the alt-right manosphere as I have, it's very, like, in places like, you know, Men Go Your Own Way, is anyone familiar with stuff like that? So websites like this actually start to imagine gender in the same way that race used to be imagined, imagining the complete erasure of women and a world in which women are no longer necessary, no longer having to be encountered with through really bizarre kind of science fiction imaginations like, oh, you know, all humans will be created through scientific kind of artificial engineering, and all sexual desires will be satisfied by some sort of weird robot women who, the only ones who want to sleep with these people, you know, ideas around like voluntary celibacy, which is again, I think, something quite new. You know, men who have been like, I will have no sexual encounters with women, no encounters with women whatsoever. This is something quite new outside of, religious orders. And so I think it's really fascinating how, at least in the kind of online manosphere mode, it's really starting to think about gender in a way that at least I don't think has been kind of encountered previously.
So I guess what I want to talk about is white femininity. And it's funny that we brought up the rebel media a fair bit today, and also generation identity, because I don't know if you've all got a list of nemesis, but I've got a list of nemesis, and on my list of nemesis is the media team at the rebel media. So the day after the Brexit vote went through, I was at a migrant solidarity march, and there was a blonde woman on the plat wearing a giant Union Jack hat, and I was just like, and she was surrounded by a camera crew, and I was just like, oh, I'll just like leave her, she's just trying to start some shit. And then some other people like jostled her and her cameraman a bit, and then camera started rolling, she's screaming that she's been punched in the face and da 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 da. And I went over, because I hadn't slept because I'd been up watching the vote, which is why I did this stupid thing, and tried to reason with her and be like, you wanted a scuffle to film it. Anyway, all this kind of dies down, I go off, I go on the march and I forget about it. The next day I wake up and it's been put out through the rebel media. I've been identified through my work for Navarra. It's been distributed through various neo-Nazi websites, and the scale of online abuse was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Thousands and thousands of tweets, ripping into my personal appearance, death threats against my family, my baby niece, rape threats, pictures of burnt and charred corpses. It was crazy. Someone tweeted my work address. And the only thing that cheered me up was actually Kojo and my best friend putting the Anthony Joshua fight on the telly, putting an ice cream in my hand and taking away my phone and my laptop. And the reason why I bring up this story is because the role of white femininity here played a really powerful role. I'm not saying that she did this because she is a white woman, or white womanhood is essentially this, but the picture that we made of a hostile, angry, brown woman and a blonde, white woman, that sets up racialized expectations of who is deemed worthy of protection, who is deemed fragile, who's got a monopoly on fine feeling and sentiment, and it wasn't me. And then in terms of what violence is considered legitimate to protect this apotheosis of all that is good and delicate and worthy of protection, well, it's the most depraved violences that, the id of the internet was able to conjure. And this is a particularly extreme example, but this logic of who is deemed worthy of protection and who isn't pervades every level of even how we form social policy. Sarah Champion, who until recently was Shadow Women and Equalities Minister, came out and wrote an opinion piece for The Sun saying British Pakistani men are raping white women. Now, I am not saying that white girls cannot be vulnerable to sexual abuse. We live in a patriarchy in which women are routinely violated and abused. But you actually look into the statistics that she was citing in terms of overrepresentation, it doesn't necessarily show even an overrepresentation of British Pakistani men in grooming cases. It showed an overrepresentation of Asian men in grooming cases in an incomplete data set, in a report that said, do not draw national conclusions from this. You then look at the racialized breakdown of who is a victim of sexual abuse, and it's actually an overrepresentation of children of colour. And again, thinking about who's deemed worthy of protection and what violences are then justified, this is shaped by a spectre of white femininity, and we can see this pattern from the slave plantation and the mistress of the house, the angel of the house in Victorian England, to indeed these kind of, you know, the mobilisation of it, the most narrow form of being a survivor in order to enact forms of racist violence. Now, how do we respond to this? Do we turn around and say, well, my solidarity is not for white women? Do we turn around and deny that there are endemic problems of sexual or gender-related violence in whatever community it is we find ourselves in? I would say, fuck no, I don't want to be a part of that. What we need to revive is a form of feminist solidarity in which we're not working against one another but with one another, where we're not trying to monopolise a particular form of vulnerability in order to impose violence on one another. And one of the things that we really need to do is shut rebel media down, because I swear to God, if I see them on roads,
yeah, I'm really glad you brought up like Lauren Southern, because her and the kind of cabal of bleach blonde mouthpieces for contemporary fascism have a very, very powerful role to play in doing precisely what we touched on earlier, which is a kind of simultaneous detoxification of fascism, and positing it as counter to not just contemporary culture, but also to older sort of toxified iterations of the far right, because our sort of go-to image of a fascist is a working class white man with shaved head and jackboots, and kicking in. Sorry, mate. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just throwing you to the lions. And what they're doing is by making the movement unrecognizable according to codes of morality that have been collectively built up over the past few decades, according to which Nazis are bad. That's kind of powerful. And also what fascinates me there is the power of whiteness in that, because they kind of made a deal with the devil here. Because if you look at how the people that they purportedly represent, the kind of 4chan like Pepes, they hate them. They really, really resent the power and the cultural capital that they have and the sway that they have over the movement. Because we shouldn't underestimate the power of misogyny as an organising force in building a coalition of different, just like the different types of scum of the earth that exist on the internet. Because Richard Spencer invented the term alt-right in like 2008, alternative right, and he named a journal after it in 2010, but it really didn't hit the mainstream until Gamergate in 2014. And this was a training ground for the kind of psychological violence, the kind of psychological warfare that is at the heart of their online culture. And this is really, again, as Ben pointed out, it looks different, but it is nothing new, because what it is a deeply misogynist impulse that orientates itself towards controlling of like feminine labour and like female reproductive functions, but poses itself as protecting precisely that function. But what that is, they're not interested in tackling sexual violence, not at all, because when Trump talks about Mexican rapists, even in the same like sentence as dismissing his own past of sexual violence, he's not really being a hypocrite there, because he doesn't really care about violation of women's bodily autonomy or anything like that. What he's talking about is a property relation according to which white men have dominion over the sexuality of all women, but in this particular instance, this kind of hallowed white feminine sexuality. And this is very, very crucial in fascism as an organising force, because, and I keep going on about this, fascism as a way of conjuring common class interests in a time in which those divisions are deepening, because what that property relation of white men over white women represents is a common interest around which all men, regardless of their other property and class relations, can organise. They've all got that in common, which is why I just want to, I'm just so, kind of fascinated by the power of whiteness as a bargain, and how profitable the wages of whiteness are to persuade white women that, given the power of the violence inherent in that settlement, actually they choose to side with white men despite that. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to quickly respond to that before we move to questions?
Only 30 seconds. So, I mean, the only thing I would add, I agree with much of that. I would say that, I mean, first of all, I think, especially as it relates to sexism, this is something that pervades every aspect of society, and actually, if anything, has deeper social roots than racism. So it applies not even, socialism isn't a thing that solves either, but especially on issues of the, sexual division of labor. This has been around for a very long time, and I imagine it would take several centuries of struggle in a social society. Politics doesn't stop there. I would say that it is important to kind of assert the difference between relative privileges and absolute privileges, in saying that even a white man who's a worker and subjected to their own forms of oppression, even if less extreme than other forms of oppression, if we give them an offer and construct a politics in which there's a bargain at the end of it where you end up ahead, then that privilege is just relative. And I think that's a large portion of what our politics should be. Even as it relates to, let's say, wages of whiteness, there's a difference between saying, and I think it's undeniable, there are at times actual material wages of whiteness. But it's often taken to mean and imply a psychological wage, which I think is more debatable. And I think there is a difference there between saying that because of stratification within the working class, certain layers at times will get privilege and on a material basis, in saying that, and leaning towards more in the direction of this being a psychological benefit. And on that, I'm more skeptical of.
Okay, so we're now going to move to questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take sort of 3 at a time. Hopefully there are more than 3 questions in the audience. And then we're going to have our speakers respond to them sort of collectively. So do we have someone who can pass? Yes. Oh, Charlotte. Thank you. Woo. She's our merch queen over there.
Our media aesthetics czar.
Cool, so who has a question? Okay, so we've got one over here.
I've just got a quick question, because I noticed the words resurgence and recurrence of fascism pop up a couple of times. I'm just going to use something that you referred to in relation to the notion of the alt-right having existed a few years before, and also Robinson and Gallagher's argument about British imperialism not being viewed in terms of discontinuities, to ask you why is fascism viewed as discontinued rather than a continuous process and a specific set of social relations and historical conditions emerging differently. Are we talking about visible and organised fascism, or just visible fascism? Thank you.
I think we had one over here.
Thank you. Thank you for a fantastic panel and discussion. I wanted to ask about the sort of anti-fascism in a communication sense. We've talked a lot about, we talked about sort of the structures and the theories of fascism and anti-fascism, but what, to your mind, does a left anti-fascist communication strategy look like?
We've got one at the back over here in the black t-shirt.
Hello. You guys. Is that a good level? Mm-hmm. Yeah. A few of you mentioned at points in the discussion about the tendency of Labour in the past to kind of, through say like anti-migrant rhetoric and Islamophobic rhetoric, how that like opens up the space for kind of far right narrative. On Tuesday, one of the fringe events is the launch of the English Labour Network, which is making the case for progressive patriotism. It seems like it's the new manifestation of Blue Labour, which I think was designed to kind of counteract like the far right and kind of get a Labour to kind of challenge the MP or whatever and try and reclaim British identity. But yeah, it'd be interesting to get your guys' thoughts on the concept of progressive patriotism.
Okay, I'm going to take one more and then we'll come back to the panels, because I want to try and, we've got 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try and squeeze as much together. Gentleman just at the back there. Sorry, my vision is so bad. Just in the middle, yeah, with your hand up now. The hand that just went up. There we go.
I did a kind of not very good university thesis on how Catholic and kind of romantic imagery came together in kind of forming fascism, or the kind of imagery behind fascism in the 20th century, and how that kind of like translated into the power dynamics that it had in terms of a transcendent ideology that had there. So my question basically is, what the fuck is Pepe the Frog? And how does this have anything to do with what I kind of was expecting to get a little bit more of? It was a bit more about how this relates to 20th century fascism, what we're seeing now that's different, because I actually find it quite hard to relate the two. Not that I'm saying that this isn't fascism, but what links them, what's different? I mean, the whole kind of like persona of the 20th century fascist leader and the whole kind of the big speeches that they used to do and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's Pepe the Frog. There's a big difference, even though practically there may be some similarities in terms of what it's advocating.
Great. Okay, so we have why is fascism viewed as discontinued rather than continuous process? What does a left anti-fascist comms strategy look like? English Labour Network and progressive patriotism, and relations to 20th century fascism. Who wants to go first?
Okay, thank you for your questions. All brilliant. One thing to get very quickly out of the way, I am sporting a Punching Pepe badge. All proceeds go to anti-fascist organisations. And we have some for sale tomorrow. Wait, or Tuesday, and Tuesday. Anyway, so, pick up on the first person's question. I think it's very, very convenient for certain narratives, and just kind of to make ourselves all feel comfortable, to pretend that capitalism is something that defeated Nazism rather than something upon which Nazism is dependent and something to which it responded. And when you forget about things like the Battle of Lewisham in 1977, I want to say, which was a street fight against a resurgent National Front, you forget the fact that these conflicts have been rolling along for ever since kind of fascism first emerged as a political configuration. And it's just very, very convenient to be able to forget that, be able to pose it as a kind of cultural problem, to be able to other it. So yeah, and I think that's because it veils the fact that the kind of things that Pascal was picking up on, that the fight against fascism is deeply imbricated with a fight against capitalism and offering people something better. And I'm just going to briefly bastardize the second person's question, to talk about a communication strategy. And what I want to talk about is a data strategy instead, because again, as Ash said, punching Nazis is really fun, guys, but it's really, really not enough. It's far too late for that. There's a fascist in the White House, and he's pretty well guarded. And even if you punched him in the face, he would only come back stronger. He's a many-headed hydra in that way. And I think the punching Pepe rhetoric is in many ways a symbol of the failure of a more comprehensive response to fascism in the way that Pascal was pointing out. And in this, we need to remember that people who fought against fascism in the 30s and 40s, I'm talking about social movements, they didn't just punch them, they firebombed offices where the records of Jewish populations were held. And that's the kind of tactic that we need to be thinking of. I'm not advocating firebombing anything, just for hello the camera there. But metaphorically speaking, we need to think about the enormous power of data collection and surveillance, and how we need to get really, really smart really quickly if we're going to protect people from the power inherent in those dynamics.
I want to respond kind of to the second half of that question, which was about similarities, differences to 20th century fascism and the role of aesthetics and symbols. I mean, listen, when you're like, Pepe, what the fuck? I'm like, I really don't know, man. Like when I look at alt-right culture and memes, from the absurd, right, like Pepe, to the downright chilling, like the reference to Chilean dissidents being chucked out of helicopters, my feeling is white people are tripping. Like, I can't get my head around it. I think one of the things that we've neglected to do is to expand our scope beyond the global north, and that's simply because there's so much to talk about. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is how the aesthetic gestures offered by fascism are a really useful tool for parties, liberal or capitalist parties that find themselves in times of political or economic crisis. And I'm thinking about the AKP and Erdogan in Turkey. I would say it's up for debate whether or not we consider Trump a fascist. I consider him a white supremacist. I think there's lots of interesting things to do with what constitutes the demos in America, and that's at the heart of his politics. But in terms of that insurgent force, I think, questionable. I think Erdogan is definitely a fascist. What's interesting is that he didn't always have that close relationship to fascist street movements that he does now. So I don't know if you know about the Grey Wolves, who are a fascist street organization in Turkey. At the time of the Gezi protests, they were anti-AKP. Now they're very much on side. And what are the two things that happened in between? One is a hard shift to ethnocentrism on the parts of Erdogan's AKP. And why was that? It was because the HDP, a political party, was making electoral gains, which was kind of advocating Kurdish autonomy. And also the mad economic promise made by Erdogan in terms of year-on-year, like 8% growth, was starting to look a bit troubled. And the gestures offered by fascism in terms of the grey wolf salute, which you now see AKP politicians doing, which immediately after the failed coup, you saw grey wolf activists doing in photos next to soldiers that they'd killed, offered a kind of sense of
collective selfhood that had been absent and which was kind of needed in order to impose some kind of sense of historical orderliness to very disordered historical and economic conditions. Now, how does Pepe do that? How does Pepe relate to this? I don't know. I'm really sorry. I answered the question that I wanted to answer because, frankly, I didn't know how to answer yours.
Brilliant. So I have I've often articulated and very deeply felt anger around patriotic, progressive patriotism, and so I will touch on that question, hopefully in the end of my ramble. But I think I might try and just tie together the first and the last questions a little bit, thinking about fascism not understanding as a discontinuity and thinking about some of the imagery that's being recovered in this moment to try and, I guess, inform this new manifestation. Because I think something that we've forgotten, and I've very much been guilty about this in our periodization of kind of 20th century European fascism and in this moment, is the way that 20th century European fascism didn't end with the defeat of the National Socialists and, Italian Mussolini parties. There were other manifestations of European fascism, and the most long-lasting of them were obviously the Iberian European fascisms. When we're thinking, and this is something that was reminded by you talking about your thesis, which I'd love to read if you want to send me a copy, but the idea of, Catholic imagery and how that was used was most clear in the first Spanish and then Portuguese examples, and those lasted, deep into the 1970s and were able to transition rather seamlessly into the liberal, globalized humanitarian project of the European Union. And I think that one of the things that we ignore when we're thinking about that continuum as well is, again, and this is talking to Ash's point of going globally, even after we get the end of fascism within Europe, you could see manifestations in places like Latin America, which are obviously pretty closely related to what was going on in the Iberian context. So there is a kind of continuous trajectory that we could trace for how this continues to shift and then re-emerge in different localities at different points. That doesn't explain why Pepe the Frog has emerged as the representation of it in this particular moment. And one of the things I just look forward to try and give me like a silver lining is to think about like future historians having to try and make sense of this, having to dig through Trump's Twitter and the same way that people read Mein Kampf or, look at the Ministry of Propaganda and so why was he attacking Arnold Schwarzenegger over Apprentice? And what significance does that kind of have to play? But I guess one element that might be able to at least give us some explanation is I think that in the same way that 20th century European fascism, like I mentioned at the start, I think was closely related to the European imperial project. It was performed by the nations that were either at the back of the queue of the European imperial project, places like Italy and Germany, or were failing, having their empires, fall apart. When we think about Spain, there's clearly a relation between the defeat of Spain in the US-American War, Treaty of Paris, 1898, and all of that, and then there's a clear line to the Spanish Civil War and the rise of European fascism in Spain. And I think that in this moment, the way that, and again, I'd share with Ash, calling Trump a fascist is something I'm still wrestling with a bit. I think he very much uses a lot of American nativism as well, understanding how there's a long history of racism and the provocations. Someone mentioned the Klan before, Know Nothing Party, American First movement, a word that he obviously mobilizes and recognizes as a trigger for his audience. And I think that in this moment, he is using this misogynistic, trolling, kind of subversive way of communicating because it captures something Bashkar said before about the hopes and imaginations of people and how they want to live. I think the European 20th century fascism tried to portray the strength and the power and the dominance as that being the hopes and dreams of those individuals. And I think that now, this moment, that kind of trolling element is trying to capture the desire for, like I say, this kind of subversive, this kind of, protection of free speech, wit, all that kind of stuff that people acclaim for themselves and see that as evoking their role and their position in the world. So, thanks. And yeah, I'll end that now, but I might chat about the progressive patriotism to the person who asked that question at length at the end.
About it.
Okay, we have 5 minutes of the panel left, so I'm going to ask, oh, sorry, 1 minute. Sorry, my vision is really bad. Yeah, so in 30-second ending statements, can we have a wrap-up of responses to those questions?
Yeah, I do think in a certain way Pepe does represent a subculture, in that there's something about, you know, the internet and the way things are developing nowadays that is like pushing like extreme segmented markets. So like there's a market now for, you know, politics on the far left that might have not been around there now, and also now there's a reemergence of kind of a far right. I think the goal is, our goal on the far left, I like to think I'm the far left, not the far left, is to get beyond this subculture and into the mainstream. And their goal is to do much the same. We have to prevent them, but I do think in many ways it's still a fringe subcultural phenomenon. It's just a worrying one. The final thing I'll say is that on the issue of progressive patriotism, I think it is a dead end. I mean, there's certain ways in which we can mobilize and use basic left populist rhetoric. We can tell people, you know, you work hard, you deserve better, and we know that, and you're not getting better, and we know the people responsible for you not getting better, and it's not, you know, it's not Muslims, it's not people of color, you know, it's you know, on Sanders' rhetoric, millionaires and billionaires. And I think that's a kind of rhetoric that works. But as far as kind of left patriotism, even in its way, it's kind of, I think, deeply depressing to set our horizons there. I think we have a far more compelling vision and narrative for the world. We have a world to win. We have a great grand narrative. You know, we have 6.9 billion friends and 100 million enemies. You know, I think we can make that compelling and relatable. And any shortcut is just going to be self-defeating. And I think that applies even to the U.S. We're going to say, all right, U.S. is, because of its original sin as a settler colonial nation, doesn't have quite the same blood and soil thing. But I think especially, you know, in Britain, you have a responsibility to reject that kind of rhetoric, especially given the history. And historically, you know, a lot of the British left has been good on these questions. It has been part of anti-imperialist struggles and whatnot. So that's a legacy that I think we can make popular and relatable.
Yeah, so I'll touch on the progressive patriotism and then kind of sum up with a few things I want to say. I do think it's a dead end. I agree with you. The left's always better when it's looking forward with a compelling vision from the future rather than trying to look backwards. I think the flag itself is just too imbued with like old forms of racism. It's just been too used by the right too much for us to take it on. I suppose, like, moving forward, so in the Labour Party, what should we do instead of progressive patriotism? I think those of you here who are members of the Labour Party should go back to your branches after this lovely weekend and all pass motions to ensure that if and when there is a fascist organisation in your town or your city, your Labour Party branch has passed a motion to ensure that there's mobilisation of local Labour Party activists against that fascist mobilisation. Obviously, there's many activists up and down the country who are involved in anti-fascist organising, but a lot of the times these are in, like, perhaps left subcultures, sort of like activists who are kind of cut off from you know, the Labour Party as a kind of a big mass. You know, I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I don't really want to be a member of the Labour Party, but you all are. So if you guys can help us out, that would be very much appreciated. And also, there's a number of anti-fascist prisoners in foreign countries. We have one from our Brighton group who's in prison. So if you could offer us support on that, that would also be very much appreciated. So thank you very much.
So lots of food for thought there, and I'd just like to say thank you all so much for coming. I hope that this was everything you dreamed it would be. And can we just have one final round of applause for our incredible panelists?
Can we have a round of applause before people run off for our wonderful chair, Dalia Gabriel. Oh, yeah.